I never had a wife. The lonely mountain man who guarded a widow and her children, Thomas Calloway, had been living alone on Pine Ridge Mountain for so long that he barely remembered what it felt like to hear another human voice in his home. 20 years had passed since he'd chosen this life of isolation, and in that time the mountain had become both his prison and his sanctuary. His cabin sat nestled among tall pine trees, so far from civilization that most people in the nearby town had forgotten he even existed. Those who did remember him spoke in whispers, sharing stories about the scarred hermit who lived like a ghost in the wilderness. At 58 years old, Thomas had grown accustomed to the silence. His days followed the same pattern, season after season. He would wake before dawn, make his coffee over the old wood stove, and spend his mornings checking his trap lines or chopping firewood. The afternoons were for his craft. He had become quite skilled at making furniture from the wood around him. His hands, though rough and calloused, could shape beautiful chairs, tables, and cabinets. Every few months he would load his finished pieces onto an old cart and make the long journey down the mountain to sell them in town. The townspeople never looked at him directly. Thomas knew why. The left side of his face bore deep scars from a terrible logging accident 2 decades ago. The incident had happened so fast. One moment he was working alongside his crew, the next moment a snapped cable had sent a massive log swinging into him. The physical wounds had healed, but the emotional damage ran much deeper. He had been engaged to be married back then, a young man of 38, with his whole life ahead of him. But after the accident, his fiancée couldn't bear to look at him. She had left without even saying goodbye, and that rejection had hurt far worse than any physical injury. So Thomas had retreated to the mountain, building his cabin with his own 2 hands, convincing himself that he was better off alone. He told himself he didn't need anyone, that the mountain provided everything he required. The forest gave him food through hunting and foraging. The streams provided fresh water. The trees gave him wood for building and warmth. What more could a man need? But deep in his heart, in the quiet moments before sleep, Thomas sometimes felt an ache he couldn't name. He would lie in his bed and remember the sound of laughter, the warmth of conversation, the simple joy of sharing a meal with another person. Then he would push those thoughts away, reminding himself that this was the life he had chosen, the life he deserved. November had arrived, with its usual harshness that year. The temperatures were dropping rapidly, and Thomas could smell snow in the air. He had spent the day reinforcing his cabin for winter, checking the roof for leaks and stacking extra firewood near the door. As evening approached, he was inside preparing a simple dinner of rabbit stew when he heard something unusual, a sound that didn't belong to the mountain. At first he thought it might be an animal in distress, but as he stepped outside onto his porch, he realized it was humans screaming. The sound was distant but clear in the cold air carrying across the forest. It was a woman's voice, desperate and afraid, calling for help. Thomas stood frozen for a moment. Every instinct he had developed over 20 years of isolation told him to go back inside, to ignore it, to mind his own business. It had been so long since he had interacted with anyone beyond brief exchanges in town. The thought of confronting strangers made his stomach tighten with anxiety, but the screaming continued, and he heard something else now. Children crying. He grabbed his heavy coat and his lantern, moving quickly despite his hesitation. Thomas knew these mountains better than anyone. He knew every trail, every dangerous drop, every safe path. The screams were coming from the old logging road, the one that hadn't been properly maintained in years. It was a dangerous route, especially in November when ice could form without warning. As he made his way through the darkening forest, Thomas's mind raced. What would he find? Who were these people? What were they doing on the mountain at this time of year? The temperature was dropping fast, and night was falling. Anyone stuck out here without shelter would be in serious danger. After about 20 minutes of hurrying through the trees, Thomas emerged onto the old logging road and saw them. A battered truck sat at an awkward angle, clearly broken down. Standing beside it was a woman, her face pale with fear in the beam of his lantern, and huddled around her were 3 small children, all of them shivering in inadequate jackets. The woman jumped when she saw Thomas approach, instinctively pulling her children closer. Thomas realized how he must look, a large, scarred stranger emerging from the dark forest with only a lantern. He stopped several feet away, trying to make himself seem less threatening. "Your truck broke down," he said, his voice rough from disuse. It had been weeks since he'd spoken more than a few words to anyone. The woman nodded, her teeth chattering. "The engine just died. I've been trying to get it started for hours, but nothing works." "My phone has no signal up here." I didn't know what to do. Thomas looked at the children. The oldest was a girl, maybe 10 years old, trying to be brave but clearly terrified. Next to her stood a boy who looked about 7, crying quietly. And clinging to their mother was a tiny girl no more than 4 years old, her lips turning blue from the cold. "Temperature's dropping fast," Thomas said, glancing at the darkening sky. "You can't stay here. It'll be below freezing in an hour." "Is there a town nearby?" the woman asked desperately. "Somewhere we can walk to?" Thomas shook his head. "Nearest town is 15 miles down the mountain. Trail's too dangerous in the dark, especially with children, and that storm's coming in fast." He could see the clouds gathering, heavy with snow that would make travel impossible. The woman looked like she might cry. What do we do? Thomas stood there for a long moment, fighting with himself. He had avoided people for so long, built his entire life around being alone. His cabin was his private space, his refuge from a world that had rejected him. But as he looked at those 3 shivering children, he knew he had no choice. "I have a cabin," he said quietly, "about a mile from here. It's warm. There's food. You can stay until morning, then I'll help you get to town." The woman hesitated, clearly weighing her options. Trust this strange, scarred man, or risk freezing to death with her children on the mountain. Her maternal instinct won out. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Thomas helped them gather what they could carry from the truck. The woman introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell, and her children were Emma, Jacob, and Lily. He learned they had been trying to reach the next county, but he didn't press for details. They all seemed exhausted and traumatized by something more than just the broken truck. The walk back to his cabin was slow and difficult. Little Lily couldn't manage the trail, so Thomas awkwardly picked her up and carried her. She was so cold that she didn't even protest being held by a stranger. Emma and Jacob stayed close to their mother, occasionally glancing at Thomas with wide, fearful eyes. When they finally reached the cabin, Thomas pushed open the door to reveal his simple home. It was just one large room with a sleeping loft, sparse and masculine, but blessedly warm from the fire still burning in the stove. Sarah nearly cried with relief as the heat washed over them. Thomas set about making them comfortable with an efficiency that surprised even himself. He added more wood to the fire, pulled out blankets, and heated up the rabbit stew he had been making. The children sat huddled together on his bed, slowly warming up, while Sarah helped him set out bowls. As they ate in awkward silence, Thomas found himself studying this unexpected family that had invaded his solitude. Sarah looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, and a sadness that seemed to go deeper than just tonight's troubles. Emma was trying to be the strong older sister, but her hands shook as she held her spoon. Jacob ate mechanically, his eyes distant, and little Lily kept looking at Thomas's scarred face with innocent curiosity rather than fear. "You live here all alone?" Emma finally asked, her voice small. Thomas nodded. "For 20 years. "Don't you get lonely?" she asked. The question hit Thomas harder than he expected. He looked at this young girl and considered lying, telling her he was perfectly content. But something in her eyes, perhaps her own loneliness, made him tell the truth. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly, "but I got used to it." As the night deepened and the promised storm began to howl outside, Thomas gave up his bed to Sarah and the children. He fashioned himself a spot near the fire, lying awake and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of other people breathing in his space. For the first time in 20 years, Thomas Calloway was not alone in his cabin. And despite his discomfort and uncertainty, he felt something stirring in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He had no idea that this one decision, this one act of basic human kindness, would transform everything he thought he knew about himself and the life he deserved to live. Thomas had told them they could stay just until morning, but morning brought something he hadn't anticipated. He woke before dawn, as he always did, and immediately noticed the eerie silence outside. When he opened the cabin door, his heart sank. During the night, at least 2 feet of snow had fallen, and it was still coming down in thick, heavy flakes. The wind had picked up, too, creating white curtains of snow that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. This wasn't just a snowstorm, it was a full blizzard. Sarah woke shortly after, carefully extracting herself from the tangle of sleeping children. She walked to the door where Thomas stood and gasped at the sight. "Oh, no," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "Storm's worse than I expected," Thomas said gruffly. "Can't travel in this. Too dangerous, especially with the little ones. Road down the mountain will be completely buried." Sarah's shoulders slumped. Thomas could see the worry in her eyes, but also something else, exhaustion, as if she had been running for so long that even this setback was just one more weight on her already burdened shoulders. "How long do you think it will last?" she asked quietly, not wanting to wake the children. Thomas studied the sky, reading the clouds the way he had learned over 2 decades on the mountain. Could be days, maybe a week. Hard to say with November storms. They can settle in and stay. He watched Sarah process this information, saw her struggling to hold herself together. "I'm sorry," she finally said. "We've imposed on you enough already. This must be the last thing you wanted." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He poured coffee for both of them, handing her a steaming mug. They stood in silence, sipping the bitter brew and watching the snow fall. In truth, Thomas wasn't sure how he felt. Part of him was indeed frustrated by this disruption to his solitary life. But another part, a part he had buried long ago, felt something almost like anticipation. Over the next few days, Thomas's small cabin became crowded with life in a way it had never been before. The children were restless and bored, cooped up in the small space with nothing to do. Thomas had no toys, no books meant for children, nothing to entertain young minds. Emma tried to keep her younger siblings quiet, constantly apologizing to Thomas when Jacob got too loud or Lily started crying. But slowly, something began to shift. It started with little Lily. On the second day of the storm, she woke from a nap and found Thomas sitting by the fire, carving a piece of wood. She approached him cautiously, her small feet padding softly across the wooden floor. "What are you making?" she asked, her voice tiny but curious. Thomas looked down at her, startled. The scars on his face often made children cry or run away, but Lily just gazed up at him with wide, innocent eyes, waiting for an answer. "A spoon," he said simply, showing her the half-formed utensil. "You look like a bear," Lily said matter-of-factly. "A big mountain bear. Can I call you Mr. Bear?" Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. "I suppose you can," he said softly. From that moment on, Lily became his shadow. She would sit beside him while he worked, asking endless questions in the way only small children can. "Why do you live alone, Mr. Bear? Don't you have a family? Do bears like honey? Can you make me a spoon, too?" Thomas found himself answering her questions, even smiling occasionally at her innocent observations. And when Lily asked him to tell her a story one evening, he surprised himself by remembering tales his own grandfather had told him as a child. Stories about the mountain, about the animals that lived there, about brave adventurers and kind hermits. Jacob was harder to reach. The 7-year-old boy was angry at the world, grieving his father in the way children do, with confusion and unexpected outbursts. One afternoon he kicked over a stack of firewood Thomas had carefully arranged, then ran to hide in the corner expecting punishment. But Thomas didn't yell. Instead, he walked over slowly and sat down beside the boy. "I get angry sometimes, too," he said quietly. "The mountain's a good place for anger. All that space, nobody to bother. You can yell as loud as you want up here." Jacob looked at him suspiciously. "Mama says I shouldn't yell. Says I need to be strong for my sisters." "Being strong doesn't mean you can't be sad or angry," Thomas replied. "It just means you don't let those feelings make you mean." Later that day, Thomas found an old piece of soft wood and a small knife. He showed Jacob how to whittle, how to let the knife shave away thin curls of wood, creating something new from something simple. "You have to be patient," Thomas explained. "Can't rush it. The wood tells you what it wants to be." Jacob took to whittling with intense focus, and Thomas noticed that the boy seemed calmer when his hands were busy. They would sit together by the fire in the evenings, both carving quietly while Sarah tended to the girls. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. But a bond was forming between the scarred mountain man and the grieving boy. Emma was different from her siblings. At 10 years old, she carried responsibilities beyond her years. She tried to mother her younger brother and sister, tried to ease her mother's burden, tried to be invisible and helpful to Thomas. She reminded him of himself in some ways. Too serious, too worried, carrying weight that wasn't hers to carry. One afternoon, Thomas noticed her staring longingly at a set of old notebooks he kept for tracking weather patterns and animal movements. "You like to write?" he asked. Emma jumped, caught staring. "I used to love school," she admitted quietly, "before everything happened. I especially loved science class. We were learning about ecosystems and food chains, and..." Thomas considered this. "Mountains full of ecosystems," he said. "Tomorrow, if the snow lets up enough, I could show you. Teach you about how things survive up here." Emma's face lit up in a way that made her look like a child again rather than a miniature adult. "Really? You do that?" And so Thomas became a teacher, sharing knowledge he didn't even realize he had accumulated over 20 years of observation. He showed Emma how to identify animal tracks in the snow, explained which plants were edible and which were poisonous, demonstrated how to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of birds. Emma absorbed everything like a sponge, filling those old notebooks with her observations and sketches. Sarah watched all of this unfold with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. This gruff, scarred hermit who lived alone by choice was showing her children more patience and kindness than many people who claim to love children. She saw how gentle he was with Lily, how he understood Jacob's anger, how he nurtured Emma's curious mind. One evening, after the children had finally fallen asleep, Sarah and Thomas sat by the fire sharing the last of his coffee. The storm had been raging for 5 days, showing no signs of stopping. "I owe you an explanation," Sarah said suddenly. "About why we were up here, where we were going." Thomas shook his head. "Your business is your own. No, you deserve to know. You've opened your home to us, been kinder than we had any right to expect." Sarah took a deep breath. "My husband died 6 months ago. Heart attack, sudden. He was only 39. We had some money saved, but it turned out he had debts I didn't know about. The bank took our house. I'd been staying with my sister in the next county, but she got a job transfer and had to move. I was trying to reach her new place when the truck broke down." She paused, and Thomas could see tears forming in her eyes. "But that's not the whole truth. We were also running from someone, a man named Tom Brennan. He was one of my husband's creditors. He started coming around after my husband died, offering to help me, but his help came with conditions I wasn't willing to accept. He scared me. So when my sister moved, I thought maybe we could start fresh somewhere he wouldn't find us." Thomas felt anger stirring in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. "This Brennan, he threatened you?" "Not directly, but the way he looked at me, the things he implied." Sarah shuddered. "I just knew I had to get my children away from him." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire crackle. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice softer now. "I need to tell you something else. When we first saw you that night, Emma was terrified. She's been scared of men since her father died, worried that anyone could just disappear. But you've changed that. You've shown her that men can be gentle and patient. You've given Jacob an outlet for his grief. And Lily," Sarah smiled, "Lily hasn't called anyone her friend since we lost our home. But she calls you Mr. Bear, like you're her favorite person in the world." Thomas felt uncomfortable with this praise. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Most people wouldn't. Most people would have turned us away, or tolerated us at best. But you've actually cared for my children. You've taught them things, listened to them, made them feel safe. Do you know how rare that is?" Thomas didn't know what to say. He looked around his cabin, seeing it through new eyes. The space that had felt empty and cold for so long was now filled with the evidence of life. Children's drawings tacked to the walls, small carved animals Jacob had made lined up on a shelf, Emma's notebook stacked carefully by the fire, Lily's tiny handprints on the window where she'd been watching the snow. "I spent 20 years convincing myself I didn't need people," Thomas said slowly, the words coming hard. "Told myself I was better off alone. That I wasn't fit for company." He touched his scarred face unconsciously. "Why?" Sarah asked gently. "What happened to make you believe that?" And for the first time in 2 decades, Thomas told his story. He spoke about the accident, about his fiancée leaving, about the rejection and pain that had driven him to the mountain. Sarah listened without interrupting, without judging, just offering the gift of her attention. When he finished, Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that would echo in Thomas's mind for days to come. "She didn't deserve you. Anyone who could walk away from a good man because of scars on his face wasn't worthy of having you in the first place. These children see you more clearly than she ever did." The next morning, the storm finally began to ease. The snow stopped falling, and weak sunlight broke through the clouds. Thomas went outside to assess the situation and found at least 3 feet of snow surrounding the cabin. The trail down the mountain would be impassable for days, maybe weeks. When he came back inside to deliver this news, expecting disappointment or frustration, he found something unexpected. Emma and Jacob were teaching Lily a song while Sarah prepared breakfast from his dwindling supplies. They looked up when he entered, and instead of dismay at the news that they were still trapped, he saw something else in their faces, a kind of contentment, as if perhaps being stranded on this mountain wasn't the worst thing that could have happened to them. "Looks like you're stuck with us a while longer, Mr. Bear," Lily said cheerfully, running over to grab his hand. Thomas looked down at the small hand in his large scarred one and felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. "Looks like," he agreed, surprised to find that the thought didn't bother him nearly as much as it should have. The cabin felt different now. It wasn't just a shelter from the storm. It was beginning to feel like something Thomas had never allowed himself to imagine. It was beginning to feel like a home. The storm finally broke after 8 days, leaving Pine Ridge Mountain buried under a blanket of pristine white snow. Thomas had been right about one thing. The trail down the mountain was completely impassable. But something had changed during those 8 days trapped together in the small cabin. The temporary arrangement that was supposed to last only one night had transformed into something neither Thomas nor Sarah wanted to name, but both could feel growing between them. When Sarah mentioned that they should probably try to leave once the roads cleared, her voice lacked conviction. Thomas had simply nodded and said, "Stay until spring, until you figure things out. No sense rushing into the cold with 3 children and nowhere to go." Sarah had looked at him with tears in her eyes and accepted. Winter settled in properly after that, and Thomas's solitary cabin underwent a transformation. He'd built proper beds for the children, using his woodworking skills to craft sturdy frames that fit perfectly in the loft space. He made a small table for Emma where she could do her studies. For Jacob, he carved a set of wooden tools so the boy could practice his whittling without risking injury with sharp blades. And for Lily, he made a collection of small animals, a bear, a deer, a rabbit, and a fox that she named and played with for hours. Sarah brought her own changes to the space. She had always been a teacher before marriage and motherhood, and she turned the cabin into a classroom during the day. She found old books in Thomas's sparse collection and used them to teach the children reading and mathematics. She made curtains from spare fabric Thomas had stored away, softening the harsh masculine lines of the cabin. She cooked meals that were more elaborate than the simple fare Thomas had survived on for years, filling the space with smells that reminded him of a home he'd forgotten he'd ever wanted. The children thrived in the mountain environment. Emma had become Thomas's eager student, learning everything he could teach her about the forest ecosystem. They would bundle up in heavy coats and venture out into the snow, where Thomas showed her how to identify different types of trees even in winter, how to spot signs of animal life, and how to move quietly through the forest without disturbing its inhabitants. "Everything up here is connected," Thomas explained one crisp afternoon as they examined tracks in the snow. "See these rabbit prints? And here, the fox tracks following them. The fox hunts the rabbit eats the bark and plants, the plants grow from the soil that's enriched by fallen leaves and animal droppings. It's all one big circle." Emma's eyes shone with understanding. "Like a community," she said. "Everyone has a role and they all need each other to survive." Thomas paused, struck by her insight. "Yeah," he said slowly, "just like a community." Jacob had grown less angry as the weeks passed. The quiet rhythm of mountain life seemed to soothe something in him. He and Thomas would spend hours together working on wood projects, often in comfortable silence. Thomas taught him to respect the tools, to work slowly and carefully, to see the potential in a rough piece of wood. One day Jacob looked up from the small box he was carving and asked, "Mr. Thomas, do you think my dad would be proud of me? Learning all this stuff?" Thomas set down his own work and gave the question the serious consideration it deserved. "I think any father would be proud to have a son who works hard, who takes care of his family, and who's brave enough to keep going even when things are hard. And that's exactly what you're doing." Jacob nodded, blinking back tears, and returned to his carving with renewed focus. Lily had become Thomas's constant companion. She would follow him around the cabin, chattering away about everything and nothing. She had completely lost her initial fear of his scarred face and would often reach up to touch it gently as if the marks were just another interesting feature of her beloved Mr. Bear. "Does it hurt?" she asked one day, her small fingers tracing the lines on his cheek. "Not anymore," Thomas said honestly. "Hurt a lot at first, but now it's just part of me." "I think it makes you look brave," Lily declared with the absolute certainty only a 4-year-old can muster. "Like you fought a dragon and won." Thomas laughed, a sound that had become more common in recent weeks. "If that's the story you want to believe, I won't argue with it." But the peace they had found on the mountain was fragile, and Thomas knew it. He worried constantly about their supplies running low. He hunted more frequently, bringing back deer and elk to smoke and preserve. He rationed their food carefully, making sure the children always had enough even if it meant he and Sarah ate less. Sarah noticed, of course. One evening after the children were asleep, she confronted him. "You're not eating enough," she said firmly. "I've seen you giving your portions to the children. They're growing. They need it more than I do. Thomas Calloway, you listen to me. We're not going to survive this winter if you starve yourself trying to take care of us. We're a team now. We share everything equally, or we don't accept your help at all." It was the first time she'd used his full name, and the first time she'd referred to them as a team. Thomas felt that warmth in his chest again, the one that appeared whenever he looked at Sarah and her children and realized how much they'd changed his life. As January arrived, bringing even harsher cold, the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home. They had developed routines and rituals. Every evening, after dinner, they would gather by the fire. Sarah would read aloud from one of Thomas's old books while the children listened, curled up in blankets. Thomas would sit in his chair, pretending to focus on his carving, but actually just enjoying the sound of her voice and the presence of this family that had somehow become his. On Emma's birthday, Sarah made a simple cake using their precious flour and sugar reserves. Thomas had carved a beautiful wooden box for her to keep her nature journals in, decorated with intricate designs of leaves and animals. Emma had cried when she opened it, throwing her arms around Thomas's neck in a spontaneous hug that made him freeze in surprise before carefully hugging her back. It was the first hug he'd received in 20 years. But their peaceful existence was shattered on a cold February morning when Thomas ventured down to the old logging road to check on Sarah's truck. He was planning to salvage parts from it, maybe try to get it running again when spring came. What he found instead made his blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the snow, recent ones, probably from the day before, and boot prints around Sarah's truck, indicating that someone had been examining it closely. Thomas's mind raced. No one came up this mountain in winter. The logging road was supposed to be abandoned. Who would be looking for them? He hurried back to the cabin, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since the night he'd first found them. When he burst through the door, Sarah looked up from where she was teaching the children and immediately knew something was wrong. "Children, go up to the loft and play with your toys," she said calmly. Once they were out of earshot, she turned to Thomas. "What is it? Someone's been to your truck." "Yesterday, maybe the day before. Fresh tracks." The color drained from Sarah's face. "Tom Brennan," she whispered. "He found us." Thomas felt anger surge through him, hot and protective. "Tell me everything about this man. Everything." Sarah explained how Brennan had been one of her husband's business associates, someone who had seemed friendly enough while her husband was alive. But after the death, he had changed. He started showing up at their house uninvited, offering help that came with uncomfortable conditions. He would stand too close, touch her arm too familiarly, make comments that weren't quite inappropriate enough to call him out on, but made Sarah's skin crawl. When Sarah had tried to distance herself, Brennan had become aggressive. He claimed she still owed him money, that her husband had borrowed from him personally. He produced papers that Sarah wasn't sure were real, demanding payment. When she couldn't pay, he suggested alternative arrangements. She could come work for him as a housekeeper, live in his house, be available whenever he needed her. The implications had been clear, and Sarah had refused. That's when Brennan had become threatening, suggesting that maybe she wasn't fit to care for her children if she couldn't even pay her debts. The veiled threat of calling social services had terrified Sarah enough that she'd grabbed her children and run. "I thought we'd lost him," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I thought up here, in the middle of nowhere, we'd finally be safe." Thomas paced the cabin, his mind working through possibilities. The truck. He traced the truck. Probably reported it abandoned or something, tracked it here. He stopped pacing and looked at Sarah. "He's going to come back." Men like that don't give up easy. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, fear evident in her voice. Thomas looked at her, at the children playing innocently in the loft, at this life that had somehow become precious to him. "We prepare," he said firmly, "and we make it clear that you're under my protection now. This is my land, my home, and nobody threatens my family." The word family hung in the air between them. Thomas hadn't meant to say it, but now that he had, he realized it was true. Somewhere over the past months, this woman and her 3 children had become his family, and he would protect them the way he'd never been able to protect himself all those years ago. 3 days later, Thomas was outside chopping wood when he heard the sound of an engine struggling up the mountain road. He set down his axe and walked to the edge of his property, positioning himself where he could see the road but also keep the cabin in sight. A large truck appeared, churning through the snow. It pulled up near the old logging road, and a man got out. He was tall, well-dressed in expensive winter gear that looked out of place on the mountain. His face was handsome in a sharp way, and he moved with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. Tom Brennan had arrived. The man spotted Thomas and walked toward him, his smile friendly but his eyes cold and calculating. "Hello there, Brennan," called out. I'm looking for someone." "A woman named Sarah Mitchell and her 3 children. I traced her truck to this area. You wouldn't happen to have seen them, would you?" Thomas stood his ground, his scarred face impassive. "Who's asking?" "I'm Tom Brennan, a family friend. Sarah's husband owed me money, and I'm worried about her and the children. They've been missing for months. I just want to make sure they're okay." "Family friend," Thomas repeated, his voice flat. That's what you're calling yourself? Brennan's smile faltered slightly. I don't appreciate your tone. I'm trying to help a woman in need. Funny definition of help, Thomas said. From what I hear, your kind of help comes with strings attached. Brennan's expression hardened. So she is here. Where is she? I have legal documents that say she owes me money. Either she pays or she comes to work for me to settle a debt. She's under my protection, Thomas said firmly. And you're trespassing on my land. I suggest you leave. Brennan laughed, but there was no humor in it. Look at you, living in a shack in the middle of nowhere. What kind of protection can you offer? Those children need proper care, proper schooling. Sarah needs someone who can actually provide for her. She has what she needs, Thomas said, taking a step forward. And what she doesn't need is you. The confrontation was escalating. Brennan moved closer, trying to intimidate Thomas with his size and presence. Listen, Mountain Man. I don't know what Sarah told you, but she's coming with me. Those children are coming with me. And if you try to stop me, I'll come back with the sheriff and social services. How long do you think they'll let children stay in your primitive cabin with a disfigured hermit? Thomas felt rage building inside him, but he kept his voice calm. Get off my property! Now. Brennan reached out to push past Thomas, apparently intent on walking to the cabin. That's when Thomas grabbed his arm, his grip iron-strong from years of physical labor. I said leave, Thomas growled. Brennan tried to jerk free, then threw a punch. Thomas, who had worked in logging camps and knew how to handle himself in a fight, blocked it easily and shoved Brennan backward into the snow. You'll regret this, Brennan snarled, getting to his feet. I'll be back with the authorities. We'll see how brave you are then. And when I take those children away from this place, when Sarah has nowhere else to go, she'll come to me. She'll have no choice. He stalked back to his truck and drove away, leaving Thomas standing in the snow, his heart pounding with fear and fury. Because he knew Brennan was right about one thing. If the authorities came, if they saw the cabin and Thomas's isolated lifestyle, they might very well take the children away. Thomas walked slowly back to the cabin, his mind racing. Inside, Sarah was waiting, having watched the entire confrontation from the window. The children were still in the loft, unaware of the danger that had just visited their sanctuary. He's going to come back, Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. He's going to bring people with him, and they'll take my children. Thomas looked at her, at this strong woman who had already survived so much. Not if I have anything to say about it, he said. But we need to do this right. We need to make this legal. We need to show them that you and the children are safe here, that this is a real home, not just a temporary shelter. How? Sarah asked desperately. Thomas took a deep breath, making a decision that terrified him more than any physical confrontation. I come down from the mountain. I face people, face their stares and their judgment. I get a lawyer. I testify. I do whatever it takes to prove that we can give these children a good home. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You'd do that? You'd leave your sanctuary after 20 years for us? Thomas reached out and took her hand, his scarred fingers intertwining with hers. For family, he said simply. I'd do anything for family. Spring arrived on Pine Ridge Mountain like a promise fulfilled. The snow began to melt, revealing green shoots pushing through the earth. The streams ran full and clear, and the air filled with the songs of returning birds. But for Thomas Calloway, the changing season brought more than just warmer weather. It brought the culmination of everything that had changed in his life over the past 6 months. True to his word, Tom Brennan had returned with authorities. The sheriff and a social worker had made the difficult journey up the mountain in early March, prepared to remove the children from what they assumed would be dangerous and unsuitable conditions, but what they found surprised them completely. The cabin had been expanded over the winter months. Thomas had worked tirelessly, adding 2 new rooms to the structure. Each child now had their own small bedroom, simple but comfortable, with proper beds and storage. Sarah had her own space as well. The main room had been transformed from a bachelor's sparse dwelling into a warm family home, with Sarah's touches evident everywhere. Curtains on the windows, rugs on the floor, shelves filled with books and the children's artwork. More importantly, the children themselves told a story that no amount of physical evidence could match. When the social worker, a kind woman named Mrs. Resonant Peterson, arrived expecting to find scared, neglected children, she instead found Emma enthusiastically showing off her nature journals, filled with detailed observations and drawings. She found Jacob confidently demonstrating his woodworking skills, proudly displaying the boxes and small furniture pieces he'd created. And she found Lily running to Thomas, throwing her arms around his legs and declaring, "This is my Mr. Bear!" He's the best. He tells the greatest stories and makes me wooden animals and teaches me about the forest. Mrs. Corey. Peterson had been doing this job for 20 years, and she knew the difference between children who were coached and children who were genuinely happy. These children were thriving. Still, there were legal complications. Brennan had produced documents claiming Sarah owed him a substantial amount of money. He argued that she was unable to provide for her children, that Thomas was an unstable recluse, that the children needed proper schooling and socialization. He painted a picture of an irresponsible mother who had run away from her obligations and was now living inappropriately with a stranger. That's when Thomas did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He left his mountain. The first trip to town was torture. Thomas felt every stare, every whispered comment about his scars. Children pointed, adults looked away uncomfortably, but Sarah walked beside him, her hand in his, giving him strength. And when people stared too long, she would stare right back, daring them to say something. Thomas hired a lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca Martinez, who listened to their story with growing interest. "This Brennan character sounds like a predator," she said bluntly. "And those debt documents he's presenting? I'd bet money they're either forged or grossly inflated. Let me do some digging." Over the following weeks, Thomas made multiple trips down the mountain. Each time became a little easier, though he never quite got used to the stairs. He testified at hearings providing documentation of his land ownership, his income from furniture sales, his plans to continue the children's education. He submitted to interviews and home inspections. Sarah fought her own battles, standing before judges and social workers, explaining her decision to stay on the mountain. "My children were traumatized after losing their father," she testified at one hearing. "They were scared, grieving, and we had lost everything. Thomas gave us safety when we had nowhere else to go. But more than that, he gave my children something precious. He gave them stability, patience, and the kind of quiet strength they needed to heal." Emma has learned more about science and nature in 6 months with Thomas than she learned in years of traditional school. Jacob has found a healthy outlet for his grief and anger. And Lily has a father figure who treats her with gentleness and respect. How is that not providing for my children? The courtroom had been silent after her words, and Thomas had felt his eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. Rebecca Martinez proved to be worth every penny. She discovered that Brennan's debt documents were indeed fraudulent. Sarah's late husband had owed Brennan a small amount for a business transaction, but nothing close to what Brennan claimed. More damning, Rebecca uncovered a pattern of similar behavior from Brennan toward other vulnerable women, though none had been willing to testify before. With Sarah's permission, Rebecca brought this information to the prosecutor's office. Brennan suddenly found himself facing potential fraud charges and was strongly encouraged to drop all claims against Sarah and stay away from the family permanently. The threat of criminal prosecution was enough to make him disappear from their lives. The legal victory should have been the end of it, but the most difficult hearing was still to come. The family court judge needed to make a final determination about the children's living situation. Thomas sat in the courtroom, uncomfortable in the new clothes Sarah had insisted he buy, feeling out of place and anxious. The judge, an older man named Henry Walsh, reviewed all the documents, all the testimony, all the home inspection reports. Then he did something unusual. He requested to speak to each child privately. Thomas and Sarah waited in agonizing suspense while Judge Walsh talked to Emma, then Jacob, then Lily. The conversations lasted nearly an hour. When the judge finally called them back into the courtroom, his expression was unreadable. "I've been a family court judge for 32 years, Judge Walsh began. I've seen every kind of living situation imaginable. I've removed children from homes that looked perfect on the outside but were filled with neglect or abuse on the inside. I've also seen unconventional families that worked beautifully because they were built on genuine love and care." He looked directly at Thomas. "Mr. Calloway, when you first came before this court, I'll admit I had concerns. A man who had lived in isolation for 20 years suddenly taking in a family, it seemed potentially problematic. But the evidence tells a different story." The judge picked up Emma's nature journals. "These show a child who is being educated, encouraged to explore her interests, and developing real knowledge and skills. The woodworking pieces made by young Jacob demonstrate patience, focus, and growing confidence. And little Lily," Judge Walsh smiled slightly. "Lily told me that Mr. Bear, her name for you, Mr. Calloway, is the kindest person she knows. She said you make her feel safe, that you never yell, that you listen when she talks, and that you give the best hugs." Thomas felt his throat tighten. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "The social worker's reports confirm that the children are healthy, happy, and thriving," the judge continued. "The home, while remote, is safe, warm, and adequate for their needs. Ms. Mitchell is providing education that meets or exceeds state standards. And Mr. Calloway, despite his choice to live apart from society, has demonstrated responsibility, dedication, and genuine care for these children." Judge Walsh set down his papers. Therefore, I'm ruling in favor of maintaining the current living arrangement. Full custody remains with Ms. Mitchell, with Mr. Calloway recognized as legal guardian and co-caretaker. All claims by Mr. Brennan are dismissed. This case is closed. The relief that washed over Thomas was so intense he felt dizzy. Sarah was crying openly, and when they stepped out of the courtroom, the children who had been waiting with a court advocate ran to them. Emma hugged her mother. Jacob grabbed Thomas's hand, and Lily demanded to be picked up, wrapping her small arms around Thomas's neck. "We can stay?" Emma asked, her voice hopeful. "We can really stay on the mountain?" "We can stay," Sarah confirmed, tears streaming down her face. "We're a family now, officially." The journey back up the mountain that evening felt different to Thomas. The familiar trail, the towering pines, the distant peak, it all looked the same, but everything had changed. This wasn't a retreat anymore. This wasn't a place to hide from the world. This was home, and he was bringing his family back to it. Over the summer months, life settled into a beautiful rhythm. Thomas continued his furniture making, but now Emma and Jacob often helped him, learning the craft. He sold his pieces in town, and people slowly began to see past his scars to the skilled craftsman and devoted father figure beneath. Some even placed special orders, wanting pieces made by that mountain woodworker and his talented apprentices. Sarah expanded her teaching, not just for her own children, but offering lessons to a few other families in the area who wanted an alternative to traditional schooling. She discovered she loved this one-on-one approach, tailoring education to each child's interests and abilities. The cabin continued to evolve. Thomas built a proper schoolroom addition for Sarah, with large windows that let in natural light and shelves for all her teaching materials. He constructed a workshop where he and the children could work on projects without cluttering the living space. He even built a small porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset over the mountains. But perhaps the biggest change came on a warm evening in late July. The children were in bed, and Thomas and Sarah sat on that new porch, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. They had grown comfortable with silence together, but Sarah broke it with unexpected words. "Marry me," she said quietly. Thomas turned to look at her, startled. "What? Marry me? Thomas Calloway? I know this isn't how it's usually done, with the woman asking, but nothing about us has been usual. You saved my life and my children's lives. You've given us a home and safety and love. You've shown my children what a good man looks like. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." Thomas felt his heart pounding. "Sarah, look at me. You could do so much better. You're beautiful and smart, and you could have any man you wanted. I want you," Sarah said firmly. "I want the man who makes wooden animals for my daughter. I want the man who taught my son that strength can be gentle. I want the man who encouraged my older daughter to follow her curiosity. I want the man who faced his deepest fears and came down from this mountain to fight for us in court. That's the man I want. So, Thomas Calloway, will you marry me?" Thomas looked at this remarkable woman who had somehow seen past his scars, past his isolation, past all his defenses to the man he'd forgotten he could be. Tears rolled down his scarred cheeks as he pulled her close. "I never had a wife before," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Never had children. Spent 20 years thinking I didn't deserve such things, that nobody could want someone like me. But you've given me everything I didn't even know I needed. So yes, Sarah Mitchell. Yes, I'll marry you." They were married in September, as the leaves began to turn gold and red on the mountain. It was a simple ceremony held in a clearing near the cabin, with just a handful of people present: the lawyer Rebecca Martinez, who had become a friend, Mrs. Peterson, the social worker who had recognized a good home when she saw one, Sheriff Carter, who had apologized for initially doubting them, and a few neighbors who had grown to respect the Mountain family. Emma, Jacob, and Lily served as the wedding party. Emma read a poem she'd written about finding home. Jacob presented his mother with a beautifully carved jewelry box he'd made himself. And Lily scattered wildflowers and declared it the best wedding ever, despite it being the only wedding she'd ever attended. The years that followed were rich with the kind of happiness Thomas had never imagined possible. Emma grew into a confident young woman, eventually earning a scholarship to study environmental science at university. She would return every summer to the mountain, bringing new knowledge and ideas, always crediting her stepfather with inspiring her love of nature. Jacob developed into a master woodworker, eventually partnering with Thomas to create custom furniture that became sought after throughout the region. The shy, angry boy transformed into a patient, skilled craftsman who taught other troubled youth the therapeutic power of working with wood. Lily grew up wild and free on the mountain, fearless and kind, with a special talent for storytelling that came from all those evenings listening to Mr. Bear's tales. She would eventually become a children's book author, writing stories about a kind mountain bear who saves a lost family. Thomas never fully got over his discomfort with crowds or his self-consciousness about his scars, but with Sarah beside him and his children supporting him, he learned to navigate the world beyond his mountain. He discovered that, while some people would always stare, many more saw past the scars to the man beneath. On quiet evenings, when the children were grown and visiting with families of their own, Thomas and Sarah would sit on their porch and watch the sunset, just as they had on that night she proposed. And Thomas would marvel at the turns his life had taken. "What are you thinking?" Sarah would ask, squeezing his hand. "I'm thinking about that night I heard you screaming on the mountain," Thomas would say, "about how close I came to ignoring it, staying in my cabin, keeping my isolation intact, about how one decision, one moment of choosing to help instead of hide, changed everything. We saved each other," Sarah would remind him, as she had countless times over the years. "You gave us safety and a home. We gave you a reason to rejoin the world." And Thomas would pull her close, looking out over the mountain that had been his prison, and then his sanctuary and finally his home, and he would think about the truth he'd learned through this unexpected family. He had spent 20 years believing he was alone because he was unlovable, that his scars made him unworthy of connection and family. But the truth was simpler and more beautiful. He had never been unlovable. He had just been waiting for the right people to love, people who saw strength in his gentleness, beauty in his scars, and heroism in his quiet dedication. Years later, when people in town spoke of Thomas Calloway, they didn't call him the scarred hermit anymore. They called him the mountain man who had found his family in a snowstorm, the devoted father who would do anything for his children, the husband who proved that love sees deeper than surfaces, and, on his gravestone, many decades later, would be carved the words that Lily insisted upon: "Thomas Mr. Bear Calloway, he never had a wife until he had everything. Beloved husband, father, and friend." The cabin still stands on Pine Ridge Mountain, now home to Jacob and his family, maintained as a testament to the truth that sometimes the most isolated hearts are the ones most capable of love, and sometimes family finds you in the most unexpected ways during the fiercest storms when you finally have the courage to open your door and let life in.